How y'all feeling? Oh, come on. Yeah, some noise. I love the hip hat. Very cool. Thanks for coming to the Ottawa Book and Food Expo. And we also had music. We also had dancing. So it's a very long title, but they've narrowed it down to book and food. There's crafts. Thank you so much for being here. A panel discussion. We had a panel discussion that got quite heated yesterday. So all I ask for is respect. Okay? I love the exchange of ideas. Very important. But respect, I think, is the first and foremost thing that we have to maintain here, because everyone's got an opinion, and in their mind, their opinion is correct. You might disagree with someone, they might disagree with you, but respect is tantamount. It's very important. The discussion is going to revolve around free speech, okay? And in this day and age, if someone disagrees with you, you yell at them. That's not necessarily free speech, though, is it? So we're going to get into it. I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and they will talk and then maybe take questions at the end. By the way, I'm Bill Wolichka from Kingston. I spent a lot of time here in Ottawa. I consider Ottawa my second home, so very happy to be here. And we will start over here. I'll ask you to introduce yourself and a few minutes explaining why you're here, why you wanted to be here, and then we'll move down the line. Thank you.
Well, hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Just wave if you can hear. Hi. My name's Julie, and we weren't, this is my friend Randy, and I forget this guy on the end. Who's that?
I forget too, it's okay.
You know what I want to say, so for those of you who don't know my story, I used to be a philosophy professor teaching ethics and ancient philosophy at one of the colleges associated with Western University in London. And I was fired in this very public way in, I guess it would be September 2021 now, for challenging the university's COVID mandates. And then since then, a whole life has unfolded that I never would have imagined. And this often happens when, you face challenges in life and you just think, oh, I can't really see through this. And yet you have this whole new life with all kinds of new challenges, but new exciting things and opportunities that you never could have imagined. And I want to say one thing, which is that I hope you don't think that because the three of us are sitting on stage and that we're all invited to speak as part of a panel, that we will all have exactly the same ideas or opinions. And please also don't think that if we don't have all the same opinions, that means that we have to hate each other. Because I'm pretty sure that we don't share all the same opinions, and yet we can still stick it out and have a conversation and keep talking. This Bill C-36 is so hot on everybody's list of things to talk and think about right now. And I was actually looking through it last night and thought the imprecision of the language makes it hardly worth speaking about, because it's not even clear what they're trying to prohibit, right? But when it comes to thinking about free speech and hate speech in a state composed of individual people who are imperfect, and we make mistakes, and we have a diversity of ideas, you can't have both. You can't have laws against hate speech and free speech, because if you have people who sometimes will experience the moral emotions of dislike or distrust, even approaching something as hyperbolic or extreme as what we might consider to be hateful, if you censor that, then you're doing something that's not true. You're hiding truth from the people. And I don't know about the rest of you, but for me, I would far rather live in a state, in a country that's true and honest, where people are able to talk to each other, than one in which we're afraid to speak because we're constantly afraid of the repercussions, legal, financial, social, of what we might say.
Sounds good. Thank you, Julie. My name is Randy Hillier, a former elected member of the Ontario Legislature. Maybe have a little bit of notoriety on a few subjects, free speech being one of them. But today, the general theme was ethics, freedom, and democracy. And I want to talk about that and how they get stitched and woven together in a society, and why they are absolutely fundamental to understand their relationship with each other. And I'm going to have a few different ideas, even though DrJulie here is a doctor and professor of ethics. I don't like using that term. I find it very malleable and very changing. And it's sort of like the word gender now. It can mean anything to anyone.
It's nothing like that. See, I told you we'd disagree about something.
Well, I prefer to use the old school word of morality, where it's defined, it's precise, it's God's words of what is right and wrong, as compared, like ethics and morality are supposed to be about right and wrong, but morality gives us a clear, precise understanding of what is right and wrong, and it's not subject to, not that I think Julie would fit in this category, but other academics may take significant liberties with that word. So morality, freedom, democracy, and just we'll expand on this a little bit through the conversation, but I would say it's something like this. When I grew up, everybody here has heard the term operating system. We've got Windows operating and Chrome, and we've got browsers and MS-DOS. And when I grew up, the operating system of Canada was Christianity, and I would say it was Christianity 2.0. The first one sort of ended with the Reformation, but Christianity 2.0 was our operating system, and now we have Gilly Bates and Klaus Schwab and Yuval Harari and all these other people who are wanting to alter the operating system of our society. I'll still go back to my original operating system. Thank you very much. That's the one I'm happy with, one that has provided for myself, my family, and ensures that we have freedom, morality, and democracy, that makes sure that all people are included and can fully participate in our society. So I'll leave that, and we'll talk about a little more about that, but I'll pass it over now to my friend Andrew Lawton, and everybody knows Andrew with the alternative media True North as well. Thank you.
So, my name, is Randy kindly introduced there, is Andrew Lawton, and I've had the great privilege of working with True North for many years, and I've written a couple of books, one of which is coming out in a few weeks' time. And as a writer, as a broadcaster, free speech has always been my hill to die on. But it's been that as a Canadian, first and foremost. And one of the great achievements of my life, of which there have been very few, so it's easy to keep track of them, is that I took the federal government to court back in 2019 because they had banned me, as well as journalists from Rebel News, from reporting on the official government-run leadership debates in the election. And we took them to court because my name starts with an L and True North starts with a T. It's forever in the history books as Lawton v. Canada, and Lawton won, thankfully. But it was a press freedom case. And a lot of the times you'll hear discussion about press freedom, and journalists will try to pretend it's in a special category, that journalists have special protections for their freedom. If you read the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it's actually a subcategory of freedom of expression. It's the same right that everyone in this room has by virtue of being in this country to freely express your views. And you'll also hear people say, well, freedom of speech is an American concept. Freedom of expression is a Canadian concept, which is true. But if you look at that and think of it for more than a second, which is asking a lot of much of the left today, the freedom of expression is broader than speech. Speech is one example of expression. Expression includes a multitude of things. So we have in this country a legal protection of free speech, notwithstanding the Charter's limitation of that, which I don't want to get too much into right now, but we can talk about it later if that's where folks would like to go. The issue in this country is the lack of a cultural support for free speech right now. And the battle for censorship and the battle against censorship, these things are not really fought in courtrooms. They're fought in the hearts and minds of people. And one example of this I'll give is deplatforming. There is nothing stopping a venue like this one from saying, we don't like the likes of Julie and Randy and Andrew, we don't want them to come here. We would not have a legal argument to say you must let us there, nor should we. But we could say there's a cultural argument. Why don't you want us there? Why don't you want people to have different beliefs? Why don't you want to have different perspectives entertained in one discussion, in one place? And that's where I've tried to devote a lot of my time. Now, I will say, when government does things like pushes Bill 63, all of a sudden you have to pivot into that legal mode, because now you have a very significant affront to free speech taking place. But my philosophy on this is very simple. Your right to speak freely should extend as far as it can, right up until the point where it violates someone else's liberty, which means that threats, which have never been allowed under law, would not be allowed. Defamation, you can say what you want, but there are consequences if you offend someone's liberty, not offend their sensibilities or offend their personality. And this is something that we need to reclaim in society. And I don't know the answer to it, except for by having conversations and not being afraid to have conversations and not siloing ourselves off where we are unwilling or unable in some cases to engage with people that believe more differently. Now, all three of us, I think, would say that we are free speech advocates. The problem is that when you don't believe in free speech, you won't even debate your position. So it's hard to find someone who is going to take the pro-censorship position because they don't like that anyone's allowed to speak freely. And
that happened here, apparently. They tried to find someone to debate us and nobody wanted to.
Yeah.
So.
Which I'll take as a great endorsement of our debating capabilities. Thank you. So I'll leave it there for now, and we'll obviously have a bit of a discussion about this. But the one thing that I will say is the crucially significant part here is that you can never, when you're debating or discussing free speech, get sucked into the realm of assessing the merit of a belief that is expressed, basically. And that's what people will always do on this fight. They'll say, oh, do you think someone should be able to say X? Because they want you to defend X. They want you to defend the most horrendous, one might even say, abuse or use of free speech. Don't get sucked into that, because if you aren't prepared to defend the worst form of free speech, it's not long before your free speech is on the chopping block as well.
You said, people want to clap for that, yeah. You said a minute ago that the problem with our challenge to free speech right now is not a political one or a legal one, but a cultural one, and we have to care about this thing. And we've heard people say so much over the last few years that politics is downstream from culture, and that's exactly right, but that's not how we think as Canadians. We kind of, even those of us who over the last few years have been the most staunch defenders of freedom and maybe the most politically active and the most outspoken, are still putting all our eggs in the basket of the next political leader to save us. And that's the ultimate, in my form, and I'm sitting next to a politician, but I think that's the ultimate form of passive-aggressive behavior, because you're a victim behavior, because someone like Randy is supposed to represent the people, not stand in as a surrogate for the thinking of the people. And so let me ask you, how many of you here are just following the political culture in Canada, hoping desperately that we get a new leader that isn't the one we currently have? Anybody in that boat? We're hoping, yes. Well, you know what? A while ago, I remember coming across a clip from the Johnny Carson show. I think it was from 1975, and he was interviewing Ronald Reagan, and Carson said, there's so much political turmoil in the country. Some people think we have too much government. Other people think we have not enough government, too much spending, not enough spending. And Reagan said, the problem is government, because government stands in for the people. And I think in Canada now, we're in exactly that same place. I worry a lot that people who are just sitting by waiting, waiting for the day, counting down the day until, say, Poilievre assumes the office, or some other Olympian to come down and bring fire to the people as though that person is going to save us. doesn't give enough power to ourselves. If you think back to the old Greek idea of democracy, it was rule of the people or power of the people. And you can't have power over anyone or anything else until you have power over yourself first. You have to know what you think. You have to be open to hearing what other people think. And we need to start creating lives for ourselves and thoughts for ourselves and not rely on someone else, I think, to do it for us.
Good points. And so I want to follow up two things with what Julie just said. As somebody who was in the political system for 15 years, you know, and I would ask everybody here to think about everything that they own, their relationships, their house, their business, whatever it is. In our culture, we have convinced everybody that the only role you have to play in our democracy is going to the ballot box once every 4 years. Okay? Now, think of, and paying taxes, yes, of course, and saying yes sir, no sir, the 3 bags full sir. But think of a relationship that you only had an interaction once every 4 years with your son, your daughter, your wife, your husband. Think of, you know, the garden that you plant. Well, I only have to go back once every 4 years. I don't have to go and pull the weeds out, and I don't have to tend to the garden. Just once every 4 years. What do you think that garden's going to look like in 4 years' time? If you had a car and you said, well, I only have to take it to the garage once every 4 years. You know, I don't have to change the oil, well, maybe it's an EV and you can just plug it in or something. But you know, you get what I'm saying is, if you want to get value out of anything in life, there's effort, there's labor, there's commitment, and once every 4 years doesn't cut it. And there are avenues available for people to be engaged and involved. And it's important, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but as an elected representative, my job is to understand the concerns, the questions, the priorities of the people in my riding that I represent. I can't do that if I never speak to you, and if you never speak to me, right? It can't be done, but we have just disregarded so much of that. But that was the first part. Hopefully I won't go too long on the second part. And part of this, you know, is actually understanding what freedom is. And why is freedom the highest protected right it's protected by our Constitution. Why is freedom have such high protection? And it's not so you can choose which hockey team to follow. And it's not so you can choose which pub to go to tonight or to go to McDonald's or KFC. Like, we wouldn't need it to be protected in the Charter of Rights and Freedom if it was just that. And this is where it stitches in with morality. Freedom is so protected because it is the freedom to oppose wrongdoing. It is the freedom to speak against wrongdoing. It is the freedom that no one can compel you to do what is wrong. That's the importance of freedom, whether it's in expression, whether it's in speech, whether it's mobility. It is indeed the only mechanism that we have ever created in humanity to allow us not to live in fear, is to have freedom. And that's the important element in freedom to be moral, freedom not to do wrong, freedom to oppose things that you oppose to, and freedom to be truthful and honest in all your dealings. So thank you. Pass it over to Andrew.
Can I respond to that, Andrew, before you?
Sure.
Well, I was just going to say, yes, freedom's a wonderful thing, but we've seen our cultural narrative shift away from talking about the importance of freedom to talking about things like security and safety. And I wonder, why do you think that is? Why have we given up on this idea of freedom? Why don't we want it anymore? We've become complacent, fear. We've become demoralized. I think all those things are true. But I think ultimately at the end of the day, what you're left with, if you're a free person, is a hell of a lot of responsibility. You have to make decisions for your life now. If you have the freedom to challenge what you believe is wrong, then you have to turn off Netflix, get off the couch, and challenge what you believe is wrong. And there's a lot of work in that. And we've not been trained for it. Our school system hasn't trained us for it. Our being coddled by the every child gets a trophy culture hasn't trained us for it. And we need to turn society around with everything from how we're raising children at home to how we're educating them to getting to the point where we see that if we want to be free, we have a lot of work to do and we have a lot of responsibility to take. And that means that if we make a mistake, we're held accountable for that, and we're saddled with feelings of guilt and regret, but that's what it is to be human. And as long as we care more about security and safety, we will never be human and we will never be happy.
Yeah, ditto. So we've all had experiences in our lives where we don't want to do something. And someone will say, oh, can you do this? And what is our instinct? It's not to say, no, I don't want to do that. It's to come up with an excuse. No, my wife needs me to do this. No, my boss called me to come into the office. No, we blame something or someone else. Now, part of that is because it's easier than telling someone, no, I don't want to spend time with you. But the other part is exactly what Julie said. We instinctively don't like that responsibility that we have. So what do? We say that we are conscripts of someone else's plans to get out of some other plan that we don't want to do. Now, that's on a micro level. Socially, it's a little thing we can all chuckle at. But extrapolate that to the big picture. We welcome censorship as society, not necessarily people in this room, when we have the right to decide for ourselves what we say. If you don't want to say something, you don't have to say it. So part of it is about control. People want to regulate the thoughts and behaviors and actions of others. But as we saw throughout the pandemic era, people were willing and eager to welcome regulation on themselves. And I think that the free speech discussion and the vaccine mandate discussion are very similar in a lot of ways because they talk about what is supposed to be an individual level decision that's extrapolated to something that's imposed. But with the vaccine mandates, it's almost more acute because someone is saying, I support this mandate. Well, that person could support vaccination for themselves. Why do they need the government to require it in certain contexts? And in free speech, it's the same thing. And I think in a lot of ways, if you can't say something, you don't have to. If you can't say something, you don't have to. And I'm not actually saying what you think I'm saying there. What I am referring to is that it takes away the comfort of speech when you have freedom. All of a sudden, you don't have the right to challenge authority, so why would you challenge authority? You don't have the right to speak unpopular opinions anymore, so why would you? So when you abdicate your free speech, when you abdicate that and when you endorse censorship, you're actually eliminating that, what I would call a moral imperative to rock the boat in some context, a moral imperative to call out untruths, to call out authority. And one of the things that's so fascinating, if you watch stand-up comedy, most of it's not funny now, but the stand-up comedy used to be about punching up. It used to be about really using that vehicle of comedy to call out authority, to call out the hegemons of society. Now it's about reimposing the regime, if you will. It's about reimposing the status quo. A lot of comics, a lot of comedians, they punch down, they defend the ruling class, which is a very strange way to be subversive, which is what the medium was supposed to be. And what was interesting to me as I've gone on this journey on free speech, I've always been pro-free speech, but I've become, as I've gone through my career and my life, a lot more focused on why it's important. And I feel like this is where we need to go back, if I can give everyone some homework at a certain point, the requirement to ask the question of why free speech is important. Now, to get philosophical for a moment, John Stuart Mill wrote a very well-known essay on this called On Liberty, in which he makes the argument in defense of free speech. Now, I don't actually agree with his premises for reasons I'll explain, because John Stuart Mill says free speech is important because it is the way that you can either enhance your conviction by being challenged. It's a way you can perhaps realize if you're wrong, you hear someone else's speech, or it's a way that two people with different views can meet in the middle. So he views free speech as a vehicle for unlocking truth. I actually view free speech as valuable not because of what it does. I view it as valuable because of what it is. And I don't take what's called the utilitarian view that free speech is a tool for something, because your right to stand up here and say something controversial like, I don't know, defining what a woman is the same right as your ability to go out to the street and sing a Miley Cyrus song if you want to. It doesn't matter how much value there is to the speech. The speech itself is good because it is free, not because of what it achieves. And it used to be up until, I'd say, 15 years ago, that would be an uncontroversial position in society, that if you were to canvass Randy's colleagues in the Ontario legislature, Ontario Liberals, Ontario PCs, probably even the NDP as well, I think you could get most of them to be on board with the idea that free speech was inherently good. Now, if you go into that same room and you say free speech is inherently good, you're going to be like, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's take that. You will actually get a rejection of that fundamental premise, because we've lost that articulation of why freedom matters, and because the alternative is someone else deciding what truth is, and someone else deciding what speech is valid and what speech is not. And who is that in a democratic society? It's the state. It's government. So do you trust government to come up with a line in the sand on what speech should be uttered more than you trust yourself as a free citizen? Well, you certainly shouldn't. You passed the test there. Thank you.
Well, and to pick up on the point about John Stuart Mill, I mean, I think one thing he got right is he talked specifically about hate speech, and he said one of the reasons why we shouldn't limit speech is because you need to let the ideas, I forget how he put it, it's so eloquent, but let the ideas get out into the atmosphere and float around and play and show themselves for what they are. And if they're a mistake, if there's an error in them, then that will show itself eventually. And if we just start systematically shutting down certain ideas or certain ways of expressing certain ideas, then we close off. It's kind of like shutting the door on truth, and we may never be able to open it again, or it may be very hard to open it again. And we're so terrified, I think, of what others will say, what we might say, as though our words have that kind of power. They do have power in a way, but at the end of the day, they're just words. They don't amount to physical harm. They are not physical harm. They're ideas. And what are humans if nothing but thinkers and questioners? And I'm thinking of the line that Carl Jung, the psychologist, said when he was looking at people in insane asylums, and he said that the inmates who are afraid are always far more dangerous than the ones who are mad or even just so angry to the point of feeling hatred towards other people. It's fear that really makes us dangerous to others. And I think this whole this whole hate speech culture is making us terribly afraid of what we might say, of what we might show to other people, how we might misstep. But that's like a kindling that's just burning underneath. And the eruption is probably far worse than if we had just said the thing we thought initially.
Yep. Let me, go ahead. Applause. There is so many little facets of these subjects, and I think so many words in our culture are being redefined and being distorted and conflated with other things. So, for example, censorship is not censorship. It is deleting misinformation or, preventing hate speech from being provided. It's very seldom in my 66 years that I've ever come across a hateful person, right? I've come across disagreeable people. I've come across many people who disagree with me. But because there's a disagreeableness, doesn't mean it's hateful, and it certainly doesn't mean it's misinformation. But you can see the path we're going on. Our culture now, Canadian and Western culture, now believes safety, security is a responsibility of the state, and that your safety and your security requires you to surrender and cede your freedoms. Because indeed, that is the only way you will ever be safe, is to be free. Free to speak out, free to leave, free to pursue your happiness, free to seek enjoyment. That's because you can look at the alternative. Look at the alternative of people who have no freedom and ask yourself, are they feeling safe and secure? And, a good example of this, of course, I think it mirrors the track that Canada is on, with some significant but important nuance and differences. But, in the USSR, their first attack was against the moral code. They went after the church. The Orthodox Russian Church, and churches, let's get rid of that. Then they took away the freedom to speak, the freedom to be mobile, the freedom of expression. And were those people in the USSR safer or more secure because they didn't have that freedom? And then, of course, the ultimate part of that is the actual government itself, that it did not, unlike a democracy where we want everyone to fully participate and fully be involved in the democracy, well, there was no point to be ever involved in democracy, and that's in their form of government in the USSR. And that's where we're heading, folks. That's where our countries in the West are heading, okay? To believe that if we zipper our mouth, if we muzzle ourselves, if we allow the government to provide for us and take care of us, like we build our own prisons in that regard, just as they did in the USSR. And so you really have to, we're on a trend line, and it looks like this, and it's pointing down pretty quick, right? And the only way that trend line is going to deviate and move is if people understand why we're on that trend, why it's important to know the difference between right and wrong and have the freedom to oppose it. And then lastly, to have to put in the efforts to make our democracy work for us and not just for the corporate and political interests that it does serve. It doesn't serve anybody here in this audience. Our political system does not serve a single individual here. It serves a political party and corporate interest, and you are the commodity. You are the one that makes them money. So it's not a difficult thing, but you have to, before we fix the system, you have to understand how it works, and most Canadians don't understand how our system works. Thanks.
I'm going to do the audience call out that Julie was doing earlier because it's a lot of fun. But You can shout out your answer. You don't need to raise your hands. Who is the biggest threat to free speech? See, you weren't supposed to get the right answer. Everyone always gets the wrong one, and then I get to be like, well, actually, everyone in this room as an individual. And by that, what I always hold is that government censorship is the most evil form of censorship. Self-censorship is the most effective. And if you say something, and Bill C-63 comes after you, Facebook comes after you, someone with a hook at the side of the stage comes after you, which hasn't happened just yet, thankfully, you have at least uttered the idea. The idea exists. And if anything, martyrdom, not that I encourage it as a pastime, but martyrdom actually tends to draw more attention to speech. If you do not say the thing in the first place, if you self-censor, you've actually kept that idea locked up and confined in your head. It will never be uttered to the point where someone else can say, you know, that actually makes sense, or you know what, I think the same thing. And to bring it back to the COVID realm for a moment, one of the things that was so effective about a lot of the really heavy-handed restrictions is that when you ban family gatherings, you ban people from avenues where they can get together and talk about how crazy a lot of this stuff is. And that was a very effective tool because people weren't putting their ideas out in the ether and gathering with other people. And speech is the same thing, which is why platforms are important. It's why, well, no one has a right to a specific platform. I think we need to have this cultural sensibility that encourages debate and discourse. Because when you self-censor, you are preemptively giving in. You are preemptively losing. You are saying that it is more important for this idea to be locked up than to risk the consequences. Now, let me be perfectly clear when I say that I understand that fear fully. I understand it. I have a career and a job where I'm very fortunate that I actually do better when I mouth off about things that I'm thinking. There are a lot of people that don't have that luxury. And there are a lot of doctors and lawyers and members of provincial parliament that have faced tremendous sanction because they dared to speak their mind. And Jordan Peterson, I interviewed, you may have heard of him, he's some professor. I interviewed him many years ago, and he had said something which was very nihilistic, but in a way comforting. He had said, you can choose your punishment because you get punished for speaking out or punished for not speaking out. You don't get to choose no punishment. You just get to choose which punishment you get. And it was hard to disagree with that. Because if we are going to face consequences and sanctions, and we are going to be punished for the decision we make of whether to say something or whether to not say something, which one is more meaningful? And the one thing that I'll say as a bit of a comforting factor is that there is safety in numbers. A gathering like this, I don't think 5 years ago would have really happened. I think there are a lot of people who have started paying attention to the threats to liberty in that time period. And I think if you were to do it again in a year and 2 years and 3 years, it would be even more. It's no longer just a left-right issue. The number of people that I've spoken to who would identify as being very far on the left but have been very pro-free speech. One example is a professor from Calgary, Frances Widdowson. The woman is a literal Marxist. I would probably find more things to disagree with her than on anything, except for on free speech, because she dared question a lot of the prevailing orthodoxy on Indigenous issues, which is just a complete no-go in academia and society today, and she faced the heavy hand of censorship. She ended up getting fired by her university in Calgary for that, but she is a left-wing victim of censorship. There are right-wing victims of censorship. Anyone who thinks that they are the uncensorable is in for a rude awakening. Sorry, I meant to end on a positive note. I just reversed the last bits.
It's okay. Awakening is a positive word. Just forget about the rude part. I think Andrew is right in his worries about the effects of censorship, but I would argue that the effects of it are even more insidious than that, because we tend to think that what we say and write, what our speech in spoken or written word, is downstream from our thoughts, and that the only harm of censorship is not being able to say what we think. But that's not the only harm of censorship. You know, I have a 4-year-old, and if you've ever had a 4-year-old, I don't know, is there a job more tiring than that? It's just constant. You know? But one thing I do notice is on the days where I'm more tired and not as up for the constant questioning, If I don't respond positively to her and ask, well, why are you asking that? Or we engage in conversation, eventually she stops asking the questions, right? So actually, what we say is not as separated mechanically from what we think and how we think and the mechanics of thinking as we might think. After a while of not being able to say what you think, what's going to happen? You're not going to have thoughts at all. And I think we're in a situation where that's happened to a lot of people. I used to teach at university, so people age 17 to 21 for the most part. And when I started teaching in ethics classes, we would talk about abortion and capital punishment and eating people, all kinds of things like, these hot topics to try to push on our intuitions about what's morally right or wrong. And the big challenge 20 years ago was to try to control the volatility in the classroom and, try to sort of manage the debate. And the big challenge in 2020, when I stopped teaching, 2020, 2021, I guess, was just trying to stimulate thoughts come hell or high water, and it was the hardest job in the world. So I guess I've had two of the hardest jobs, trying to get people to think and trying to stop 4-year-olds from thinking.
I would just like to point out, my colleague Lindsay Shepard was punished for playing a 3-minute clip of Jordan Peterson while Julie was talking about cannibalism in class. So take from that what you will about the academic sensibilities of our
Jordan
era.
was probably talking about cannibalism too. But
Maybe.
Well, I think that is important, and we have to again look back. I have 4 adult children. I have 8 grandchildren. I went through the public education system. The difference that I saw happening to my children in the public education system caused me to be quite outspoken. And oftentimes I have to go to the school and have a disagreeable conversation with the principal and the teachers. Because it was clear that our education system had taken on the role that conformity, consensus, obedience were the prime virtues in the classroom, not the critical thought, not the critical writing and the curiosity and the exploration and the examination or the evaluation of a subject. It was consensus, conformity. And, this is why we have a big problem in our society. Well, we were busy earning a living and doing things. Somebody else was educating our children. And they were educating our children in these false virtues of obedience. And, and this way we see this, and this has been exasperated and amplified, with the other technologies of social media. We've got a big problem here. And we have to help everyone understand what is wrong, what we can do to fix it, and to everyone here, what you're doing here today is helping to fix the system. You're engaged, you're involved, you're participating, and and you're doing it in the real world, not just online and in the virtual thing. You're showing people that you are curious and that you're interested and that you are free to come and hear these extreme right-wingers from the small fringe minority.
We seem pretty extreme. On that note, maybe we should invite some questions or comments from people. Oh.
Okay, who disagrees with us? You get to the front of the line. Ah, that's no fun. Okay, I think you're faking it because you weren't sure, but the guy in the hat said he disagreed, so.
Yeah, we'll get a microphone to you. Hold on.
1, 2.
Hold on for a minute.
I partially disagree. I wouldn't necessarily call it even a disagreement, but serious question. Randy and Julie were talking about how it's important to do more than just vote. We have to actively engage with the system.
I can't hear you. My hearing's bad.
Hang on,
Is this better?
he's putting
Is
the
this
volume
better?
up. There we go.
Okay. So I was saying that Randy and Julie were saying that we have to do more than simply vote once every 4 years. We have to engage with the system. I partially agree with that, but my question is, what can I do? Not we, because what we can do is stuff like the Freedom Convoy, the Million March, what we're doing here today. What can I, as an individual, do? Someone with no money, no job, not much more than the clothes on my back and the apartment I live in.
So we starts with I, and we as an assembly of I's. So while I agree with your fundamental point that we need to break this down to an individual level, I think finding communities is crucially important and never letting, because one of the challenges when you talk about censorship is you're actually oftentimes seeing assaults on communities. Remember, that same section of the Charter also talks about freedom of assembly, because assembling is where ideas are shared. Assembling is where expressions are uttered. So I think my point on self-censorship earlier, I think, is a valid one, which is actually speaking your mind, not letting yourself be cowed into submission on an individual level, but it's turning the I into a we. It's finding other people around you so that when something does come up, you've got your core group of 3 or 4 or 5 that can show up at your city council meeting and say, hey, this ban on having signs of some variety is wrong, so that you can write the letters to the MP. And those, when you 5 get in the line at the city council meeting, 50 more see you and want to join you. So I think that's crucially important, but everyone wants someone else to be the leader. Everyone wants someone else to stick their neck out first, and everyone has to try to be that person.
Who do I give this microphone to?
Another good question. Can I follow up
There's a lady in front of you as well, but
with the pink scarf?
yeah, that's fine. You can ask. You'll be next then.
A little disagreement.
Good.
I don't necessarily feel the government is the source of our problems. And I'm here to ask you all, what is the organizing structure that put us into a lockstep in 2020 in the world and shut down the world in 6 weeks? Is it corporations? Where's the organization? What's the money? What's the thrust? And we're in lockstep, and we're moving fast. The organization of gender ideology is moving really quickly. Came out of nowhere, and it's enveloping everybody, especially in North America. So in your opinions, what is the organizing structure? Bilderberg?
I'll take a kick at the can. So, I mentioned earlier that that there's a seamless integration between the corporate world and the political parties. And as far as I'm concerned, all established political parties. There are none different, right? So that is the, in the 1930s, we called that fascism. That's the true definition of, in more colloquial language, we call it P3s, public-private partnerships. There's many different ways, but the corporate interest is the important interest in our government, not the private interest, not the public interest. When we would discuss something in caucus on a subject, we wouldn't talk about how it might benefit Mary or Dal or anyone else. We talked about how would the party benefit? How would our interests be advanced? Right? So, and that, again, the corporate world is enmeshed and immersed in the political system where you guys are not. Right? You don't participate.
Well, we do, to the extent that we're consumers of the things that...
Yeah. but you're not involved in on the influence side of politics. So, hey, well, sure. So it's all about it's all about money, and it's all a con job. And when I was down in Washington, I said, in my lifetime, I've gone through the Y2K. Planes were going to fall out of the sky. We had to spend hundreds of millions of dollars at Y2K. There was a hole in the ozone layer. We had to fix the hole in the ozone. We had acid rain. I went to bed as a young child terrified of the looming ice age when I was a little boy, only to wake up as an adult into global warming. Okay? It's all a con. Okay? And it takes money from you. And as long as you're going to be on the sidelines, not involved, COVID was the con. Okay? The lockdowns were a con. And we all knew it, just that we also knew that there would be consequences for exposing the con. My views.
It's just about the biggest question I think you could possibly ask. And Randy's hinting at and circling around a lot of important things that are affecting our lives, that exist well beyond anything we ever think about on a daily basis, I think. And how can I say this in a summary way, but to think that the ultimate decision maker in our country that affects our lives is Justin Trudeau is not to have a very big picture of the world. And I think we've all written and spoken about some of the bigger global factors at work. My area, bioethics, I've written about, in the new book I have out, I've written about how conflict of interest and regulatory capture, basically between the regulatory bodies like the FDA and the pharmaceutical companies, basically created the opioid epidemic that's still causing massive depression, suicidal tendencies, and suicides among young people at record rates right now. I mean, that's just a micro example. And if the question is, we don't want to just be a bunch of complainers and naysayers, but if we want to think, well, how can we fix this? I think we do need to think about our role as individual consumers. So every time we buy a product from a pharmaceutical company, for example, we are fueling, we're directing the thing, money, into a system that keeps it going. And I think that's why we're seeing so many parallel economies, parallel health systems, either with supplements or natural approaches to health, and so many more people getting interested in educating themselves about health-related things, because we're realizing we're told that so many pharmaceutical companies, pharmaceutical products, for example, are harmless at worst. And we're finding out that even things like Tylenol can have very serious effects on our health. And so the question is, well, then how do we respond as the gentleman said earlier, I'm just one person. I just have the shirt on my back. I just have this small sphere of my life in which we operate. But what we do with our money, how we behave as a consumer, is one of the most powerful things we can do. It doesn't work to just tweet on social media all day about the Pfizer documents and then go and stock your medicine cabinet full of Pfizer products, right? We have to act with our money. And I forget the name. Maybe Andrew or Randy can remind me, but there was a Czech dissident who ended up becoming the president of Czechoslovakia, and he said that you have to build. Anybody remember his name? I can't remember. It starts with an H. It's like Havlev. Havel, yes, thank you. And he said you have to build parallel economies within the totalitarian state in which you are living. And if you're thinking, what's totalitarianism? Do I live in a totalitarian state? I thought we had a democracy. Well, totalitarianism is a form of government or rule by an individual that has total control over every aspect of your life. Do you feel like there's total control being taken over every aspect of your life? I do. And we have to take it back, and that requires the two big R words, the responsibility we were talking about earlier. It requires a lot of research. It requires doing a lot of work that we've been able to download onto our representatives, onto our professionals, doctors, lawyers, dentists, accountants, for a long time now. And we can't trust them to do that work for us anymore.
The question was about the organizing forces of the world. And I take, I think, a very different
Did
view.
I get off track? Is that what you're
No,
saying?
you started on track, and then you gave yourself a buffer to go broad. And I just have to go back to the nucleus of the question here, because I actually think it's very easy and oversimplifying for people to try to define the world as a hierarchy. And that, we have our municipal government, our provincial government, our federal government, and then on top of that, there's a global government of some kind. Because I think it negates the one reality that we've seen in our political leaders, which is that a lot of them are very weak-willed people. And I've actually had I don't know if privilege is the right word, but I've been able to go to the World Economic Forum as a journalist, not as an invited guest, I assure you. And one of the fascinating things, and I wasn't invited back after my one attempt as a journalist, so that was a good one. But the thing that I find most fascinating about it is how phony it all is. So when the one time I had accreditation as a journalist there, I went into the room and it was the Prime Minister or President of Spain, I can't remember which one it was, who was speaking. And these are the speeches you see the clips of, the videos. They're in this big giant room. There's a big giant stage. And I was in the room. A head of state is speaking. And there were 17 people in the audience. 17 people, and it was a giant room, 1,000 chairs, 17 people, and most of them were staff. It was all fake because they're playing to the camera. They're not playing to the group that's there. And then you wonder, well, where are all these people? Where are all the delegates of the World Economic Forum annual meeting? And you go around the corner, and they're all in these multilateral rooms, these meeting rooms where a bunch of these people are meeting business leaders, corporate leaders, off the agenda you never see. Now, is that global government? I do not believe it is. I believe it's cash for access. I believe it's big money and big power coming into one space. But the problem that I find with a lot of these global summits, whether it's UN treaties, or not treaties, UN negotiation conferences, World Economic Forum, all of these types of avenues, is that a conservative leader elected in a country, a liberal leader elected in a country, they all tend to sound the same when they're together. The G20 summits, the statements, they're all speaking with one voice. I mean, Giorgia Meloni, the far-right, radical, raging populist in Italy, is signing the same statements as Justin Trudeau when they go to these G7 and G20 summits. So what is it that causes that? I do not believe it's top-down. I do not believe anyone's pulling the strings. I think all of these people, at their core, really want to be liked. And they really want this community to develop at the global level, because all of them want their soft landing afterwards. Chrystia Freeland wants to be the Secretary General of NATO, and Justin Trudeau, maybe he wants to go and run the OECD. And they all sort of talk about these things, and then they come back to the country, and we're the ones that are faced with the consequences. So I don't believe it's top-down, and if it is top-down, that actually is very convenient, because it tries to say that we don't have power. And I think we need to look at this in reverse as a bottom-up.
Yeah, let me just finish. I think that's all good, and I think that's all true. And it is a bottom up that is required. But I wanted to say, Andrew said that when all these conservatives, liberals, whatever, they're all together, they all sound the same. Well, guys, the only time they talk differently is during the election campaign. They all govern the same. They all think the same. They all have the same corporate controlling influences within their parties. It's, the election campaign, the whip period is the stage. It's the con. Okay? They're all going to do the same. Right? Orange, green, red or blue, there may be some deviations, but it's very subtle. They're all going to get to the same place soon enough. So that's my 15 years of being in elected office. Let's put on a good show for you. And let's get the tribe motivated. Let's get them to give some money. Let's get them busy putting out some signs and knocking on doors for us, get that tribe going. And then we'll be just like,
We are now.
Who's ever heard of an election promise fulfilled? Right? Like, I remember if John Chrétien was going to get rid of that hated GST that Brian Mulroney brought in. And that was in the early 90s. 2 members of his caucus spoke out. Sheila Copps and John Nunziata. Sheila Copps, well, she got a talking to and she tucked tail pretty quick. John Nunziata stuck to his guns and he was out of caucus. Right? That's the way politics works. But I better shut up because I could go on.
Hello. Okay, hi. So I'm Gunna Hickey, and I'm First Nations, and I'm known for speaking about being a murdered and missing Indigenous women survivor, and so my speech is not popular. I have a question in response to something I heard from Dr. Ponesse. I hope I said that right. About hate speech, and you mentioned that you were saying along the lines that words are not as powerful as people make them out to be, or they're just words. So what I wanted to say is that, although I don't speak for all First Nations, generally speaking, we feel like in society, people are conditioned to value the wrong things. And the things that should be valued are somehow put aside as if they have no value. And then our idea of morality is also different. And so then we see many problems with the moral code that you talk about. And in my view, ideas can affect genetic expression. In my view, words have energy and they also have frequency, and there's a power in that. Some ideas are traps, and some ideas are mind prisons. So I want to put this bug in your ear, and I encourage everyone to think about that expression I just used, a bug in your ear. Elon Musk, sometimes I repost some speech that he made about how ideas can affect genetic expression. And so then some people have a lot of difficulty. If they get caught with such a bug, they have real difficulty escaping such a mind prison that I think can be caused by hate speech. So I would like to hear anybody's response on that. Dr. Ponesse or anyone that wishes to respond. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question or comments, I guess. I certainly wouldn't want to say that words aren't powerful. Words express our ideas, and ideas are powerful. That's certainly true. But I don't think that mere fact means that we should prevent people from expressing them. Again, we're sort of back to what Andrew was saying about Mill's point, and how I can't help but think we're better to let ideas out in the public sphere, let them work themselves out, and let them try and see how we do with them. I've yet ever to see an argument for hate speech laws that isn't more costly than the costs we would have without them.
Oh, yeah, it works. So speaking of a bug in the ear, let me do that now. There's been a lot of talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women. The bug I'd like to put in people's ears, there's a lot of missing and murdered Indigenous men as well, but we never talk about them. That being said, I'll just go straight to the question I had, which has to do with ethics, because my issue here is with the, how can I say, very quick changing of word definitions. Even, it takes 24 hours for the Merriam-Webster to put a new definition on the internet these days. And from that aspect, I don't think they're very ethical. And so if you want to comment about the ethics of changing definitions continuously, I'd really like that. Thank you.
Right, lots packed in there. I mean, whether or not it's right to change words, and there's a whole question about philosophy of language and how language works and how words develop. But I think if I understand the essence of your question or the essence of your concern is, what is it saying about our culture that we're so interested in doing this, or that we're so willing to accept these rapidly evolving definitions? And I think one thing we're seeing now is that there is a kind of what we call incremental creep going on all over the place. If you want to change people's mind about something, you want to change how they think, you want to change their behavior, and you just present to them an idea that's radically different from what they've been believing, they're most likely just to slam the door in your face. I mean, when Hitler came along, I'm sure he didn't, we know this, he didn't propose to the German people, hey, I'm going to round up 6 million Jews and send them to the gas chamber, what do you think? In dead silence. I know that sounds horrible to say. That's not how it happened, right? It was very slow, it was insidious, there was a lot of language about fear, about how we're protecting you, about how we are eliminating this threat to your livelihood, about how these people are a virus that is parasitic on your lives. And the language evolved over not just months, but years to get to that place of a great atrocity. And I think you're quite right to notice that I would encourage you to watch this if you notice the new words that are cropping up or the evolution of words, and it affects how we think about them, right? So even the term, something like gender ideology, when you hear it, it suggests to you that such a thing exists. But I would encourage you to pause for a minute and say, well, does that exist or does only gender exist? Is there such a thing as gender? Are these things biological realities or are they social constructs? Those aren't rhetorical questions. I encourage you to really think about those things yourself. But thank you.
I'd like to just add it on here as well, because from the political world, the greatest number of employees that I've seen in my time that political parties and governments employ are English literature specialists, okay? People who have great communication skills and who can, and it's the same in the marketing and the corporate world. Marketing and getting your language and your words massaged and to create a new image in your mind from an old word. And by changing the definition of that word. It really is, this is not a bunch of rational economists and legal beings and engineers that political parties are hiring. These are communication specialists, because that is the key. Like, listen, we're even changing words that are a definition, like woman, like that is a definition. How can that definition be altered? Okay, but we're doing it, and again, that goes back to the comments of a public education system that has inculcated an idea that conformity, consensus is the highest virtue. Don't oppose. Don't say anything about wrongdoing. Just accept. Like there's another one in my the term toxic masculinity. Like to be masculine is toxic.
Essentially,
Like,
there's no other option.
So there is no other option. If you're a man, you're well. I didn't know they could define what a man was back then, but they did, and they said it was toxic. Okay. So yeah, these things are not just, they're part of our culture now. We've been accepting them. We didn't reject them. As a dad, I didn't reject them hard enough when my kids were in school.
And it doesn't take very long, once you've been believing that words don't really have meaning and it doesn't matter how we define them, to get to the point where you think, well, I guess nothing has meaning then. And now, who said demoralization earlier, right? We're in this point where we're demoralized, and Peterson was saying we're in this nihilistic place. We've lost meaning, not incidentally because we've changed the words that we've been told we can use to describe our lives.
To not necessarily interrupt, but assert myself. Speaking of changing definitions, consider the word inflation. If you look at the definition of inflation in the 80s, our inflation rate today would be closer to 15%. but we keep changing the definition to keep the numbers lower. And the latest ploy is that we say inflation is this, but the inflation rate is this amount, but we exclude food and energy. So there's always playing around. Now, I do have a question. I'd ask you to comment. I attended university in the 70s, and we had some very spirited discussions, differences of opinion about socialism, freedom, and capitalism. But at the end of the day, we always said, I will disagree with everything you say, but I'll fight to the death your right to say it. And today, we have the same differences of opinion, but we're not allowed to discuss them anymore. And I think we've got to get back to those days when we had the discussions. I'd ask you to comment.
Yeah. It's now I disagree with what you say and I'll fight you to the death over it. And we talked about this earlier kind of in jest, that there's no one up here taking the free speech critical position. And, for example, most people who put up your hand, if you, forgetting the government's definition, put up your hand if you believe that hate speech has no place in Canadian society. Okay, now keep your hand up if you believe that the government can and should make that happen. Okay, and that's fair. And by the way, if anyone had kept their hand up, that's, I think, entirely fine. What does hate speech mean, though? And this is the challenge that we're always going to be up against. So I'll give you one example. The Ontario Human Rights Commission, which is the body that adjudicates human rights complaints in the province of Ontario, as the name suggests, believes that misgendering someone violates provincial discrimination law. So if you use someone's wrong gender or what's called their dead name, the name they were assigned at birth, that is a violation. So you extrapolate that to federal human rights code, where we have now Bill C-63 that's going to use the same human rights criteria, including gender identity, and start managing what you can say online. Using the wrong pronoun for a Caitlyn Jenner could be, if the government is feeling particularly overzealous, an act of hate speech. I have occasionally been called names by critics, which I don't mind. And I did a documentary interview with TVO about a year ago, which they never ended up releasing, which I guess meant that their argument didn't hold up. Because they were talking about the term far right. And they were asking me to condemn. I don't know if I was actually meant to be the representative of the far right now that I'm describing it, but instead of just a dispassionate observer of it. But the point that I made is that I can't begin to answer your questions about what I think about the far right in Canada until you tell me what far right means. Because that term is useless if not everyone is working from the same definition. And this is the problem we see, and it's why media is so tremendously important to have discussions about. I mean, that question about redefining language. During the pandemic, Merriam-Webster changed the definition of anti-vaxxer to include someone who opposes vaccine mandates. So you could be, according to Merriam-Webster, a 7-dose Pfizer frequent flyer and be an anti-vaxxer if you don't believe it should be mandated, which is a particularly absurd concept. So anytime you... my free speech was taken away there. Who did that? So you have to go back to the basics. And one of the things that university actually taught me very well, I mean, it taught me a lot of nonsense that I needed to get out of my mind, but I wish I'd had Julie as a professor. But you have to define your terms. And I wrote one paper once where I had spent half the paper defining the things I was going to talk about in the rest of the paper because it was impossible to have a discussion without everyone knowing what I was actually saying. And we don't get that. We get terms that are thrown out that are not defined, like hate speech, like far right, like racism, like phobias of various kinds. And these things are useless unless everyone in the discussion has the same definition.
I wouldn't mind adding one other comment to that. And that is, you mentioned being in university in the 70s. And that's my era. I didn't go to university. But that was that was so commonplace, that phrase, that it was almost cliche. It was so used, I'll defend your right to speech, even if I disagree. But along the journey of our culture, we've also created and found profit in creating division within society. That's, all our political parties, all our social media platforms, most of our mainstream media, all took a very active role in creating division within our society. So it's no longer that I don't like what Mary says or that I disagree with what Mary says. That's unimportant because she's a bloody liberal, or she's a bloody conservative, or she's a bloody something. Okay, and in universities and whatnot, this intersectional garbage and nonsense. It's all about division. That's the new operating system for our society, is division. There's money in it, and this getting together, speaking with one another, being dignified human beings, is a great threat to that.
And I think that's.
What are you saying, Randy?
Yeah, Alan.
Thank you for taking my question. I just noticed that Gina Watteel is selling her book, Fistman's Fraud, The Rise of Canadian Hate Science, over there. I suggested that the Ottawa Public Library purchase the book. I've got them suggested about 20 purchases over the years, and majority were rejected, but some of them they did approve for purchase. I got a refusal, and I was shocked at the grounds for it, which I'd never seen before. Usually the refusal would come based on limited budget that they have. And as an economist, I could hardly argue with that argument. But the refusal was based on a failure to obtain, quote, an independent / authoritative third-party review that supported purchase. To me that really smells of an attempt for the Ottawa Public Library, which is, subject to the Ontario government, which was very much in favor of the vaccine mandates, to quash purchase of a book that was very critical of the study on which both the federal government and the Ontario government based their vaccine mandates. Do you have any comments on this? And do you think that's a general problem with the public library system across the country? Become more politicized? Thank you.
Let me add, say a little comment, and I think maybe you want to jump in here. But here's a good example. The Ottawa Public Library has rejected and will not allow Dr. Gina Watteel's book in the library, right? They've said, that goes against the grain here. That's not. But every institution, whether it's the library, whether it's the hospital board, whether it's the Legion, everything in our society has a local board, right? So, and it's made for local people to be on those local boards to give guidance and direction, okay? So there's nothing preventing the people here in this audience from being on the Ottawa Public Library Board. And maybe they could use some thoughtful guidance and say, no, we want that book in there. And at the same time, we don't necessarily need the Drake Queen storytelling time as well. But this is the role of the individual in a democracy, is to be engaged in all these things that you're passionate and interested about, and that you want to see better for your children, for our grandchildren, for whoever. That we all have brains. Let's put them in there and give them a piece of our mind while we're doing it. Thank you very much.
I think we're pretty much wrapping up, aren't we?
Yeah. Yeah. I just wanted to say thank you. Just on the library note, I wrote a couple of years ago a book about the Freedom Convoy, which I was very grateful did tremendously well in sales, but had no mainstream media attention. Indigo banned it from the store shelves. And when asked why, they said, well, we know the Indigo consumer, and it's not those types of people. And one of the cautionary tales of that was that it didn't really matter, is that all of these forces couldn't really get in the way of Canadians that wanted to understand that story. And I think that's the lesson that I have taken on the free speech fight as well, is that there are a lot more normal people out there than you think there are, and you're a lot less alone than you think you are. And never forget it.
I guess, yeah, I think Andrew's right. Andrew's right about that. Maybe the last thing I'll say is we've talked a lot about division today, and the gentleman who you raised the point about university and what you were doing there in class was having discussion and debate. And what that debate is people coming to the table and being willing to change their view. If you aren't willing in the presence, being faced with evidence to change your view, then you have no business having a discussion or debate with someone. So when we have our political debates, that's in name. There's no debate going on there. It's just people saying their thing and say, because none of them ever have a position of willingness to change their view. So a little bit of advice, if you're going toe to toe with your sister who's pro-mandate, pro-Trudeau, pro-everything, and you're exhausted, maybe it's time to give up. You have to ask yourself, does this person have the possibility of changing her mind? And ask yourself the same question. I mean, does it make any sense to go on having a conversation if you're not willing in the face of compelling evidence to change your viewpoint? And that's the hardest thing in the world to do, because you have to admit that maybe you were wrong. Now I have to do some work to learn about this new point of view, but that's what makes society stimulating. Outlawing the Fistman's fraud in the library, charitably, someone might say, oh, well, we don't want more division. We don't want more, ideas to challenge the prevailing viewpoint. But in reality, that's not what happens. You get more ideas out into the public sphere. People think about them, people discuss them. They might still hold your opinion, but holding differences of opinion is not division. I'm sure if Randy and Andrew and I sat down and talked long enough, we'd find some things we disagree about, but we'd say, I think we can still go for lunch after and have a nice conversation, right? You can hold differences of opinion without there being division. And that's what we need to think about, I think, moving forward.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and thanks the hosts of the International Expo for inviting us. It's been a lovely, lovely morning with Julie and Andrew and with everyone. I'll say there's still lots of battles out there. I'm back in court again this week. Was in there twice last week. If you want to help me out, follow me on nomorlockdowns.ca. I'm on Substack. I've found a few other places where there's less censorship than some of the other ones, because some of the other ones still don't like what I have to say. But anyway, thank you very much for being here. And yes, if we wanted to take the time and effort, we could find something that we would find disagreeable with every one of us, because we are not perfect. None of us are. But it is so much more worthwhile and so much more rewarding to find the goodness in people than to find the disagreeable imperfections. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day. and we'll chat again soon.